Hello, this is the HAARP Report. I'm going to read to you a posting from Godlike Productions from 2012, and I believe this account is true and factual, and also it explains what that big white mystery building is at Tinker Air Force Base, that it's a pharmaceutical factory. Probably not used anymore, but apparently it was used at one time for developing different pharmaceutical psychoactive chemicals, which were then sprayed from airplanes. So this guy titled his blog, "I spent 17 years developing various chemicals for chemtrails. Ask me almost anything." Can't tell you the name of my employers, nor can I tell you the exact chemical compositions of the mixtures I helped develop. I can answer almost everything else. So this is a very long post. If I read it all, it's over an hour, so I'm just going to read the highlights to explain what he was doing and his part in this organization. Does Evergreen Airlines out in Arizona have planes modified for this? I can't say with 100% certainty that the chemicals I worked on ended up in Evergreen planes, but I do know for a fact that cargo airline companies like Evergreen routinely accept large sums of money to load and disperse chemtrails, much more lucrative than just hauling cargo. What are their purposes? Too many to count on 10 fingers. It really depends on where they are going to be used. Many are calming agents. Others induce a state of haziness. He's talking mental haziness, not haziness in the sky, because later he mentions that they didn't do any compounds that can block out the sun. Rarely we were asked to develop mixtures to incite anger and rash behavior. 90% of what we worked on was aimed to alter emotions, mood, and state of mind. So literally pharmaceuticals being sprayed from airplanes. Toxicity. In almost all cases, it was made very clear to us that what we were working on should have minimal toxicity. Naturally, a small percent of the population will have allergic tendencies, blah, blah, blah. They definitely wanted them to be non-toxic. Breakdown or accumulate varies a lot with the chemical structure. Some of the mixtures we developed were intended to dissipate to concentrations as low as 1 part per billion by the time they reached ground level. Others were specifically designed to reach ground level and last up to a year, even after rain, wind, snow, etc. Do you have any idea who's behind the spraying? Do you mean which airlines conduct the spraying, or who coerces the airlines into doing so? I don't know. I do know that 99% of the time a commercial pilot is unaware that their plane may be spraying chemtrails. I realized after some time that whatever organization is behind the scenes of all this is very good at making sure to directly deal with as few people as possible. I never knew who was contracting my employer's services, not once. I do know that North America is not the only continent that uses ADCs, aerially dispersed chemicals, without the knowledge of the population. However, I also know that the chemical technology of other countries are close to a decade behind that of the United States. So that means that other countries like Europe are probably still spraying the homogenized coal ash, whereas in the US they've gone to different jet fuel additives and maybe high naphthalene, JP4, that will produce phthalates in the jet exhaust, and like Dane says, hygroscopic materials that have a positive heat of solution that will actually provide a cooling or even ice nucleation effect, and that would be a fuel additive. So more research is coming on that. I never knew where the chemicals I worked on ended up being used. Like I said before, there was a lot of secrecy. I only did it for 17 years because the paycheck and benefits were beautiful. All I can say is that sometimes we were given the job of developing chemical mixtures expecting very specific results, which gave me the sense that they would be used for a specific area. State, county, city, I don't know. I do know that it would be very hard to target an area smaller than a city from the altitude of a commercial airliner. Although I did work on a couple projects where the intent was to develop a mixture that would not disperse very far, just drop as fast as possible without spreading out. And that may be the chemtrail spider webs that I made 2 videos on back in 2015. If you don't believe they exist, go watch those videos. They said they used barium in more than one final product, but they had to make sure it would dissipate to non-toxic levels by the time it reached the ground. Barytosis was a huge concern of our contractors. When developing anything that required barium, most of our final mixtures that used barium were designed to reach ground level in concentrations of 1 part per million or less. So to keep this program secret, they definitely wanted no overt connection of illness to the spraying. What do you want to tell us? I don't really want to tell you anything. I've been out of the business for long enough to the point where I feel safe revealing some of the details of my employment, that and this glass of scotch. Reasons for spraying, like I said, we never knew the contractor's true intent, but 9 times out of 10 it was pretty obvious, because when asking us to develop chemical compounds, they have to tell us what they want them to do. To name a few: weather modification, emotion suppressants, emotion expectorants, bringing the emotions to the surface, environmental modification. Also interesting that you should mention sickness, flu symptoms, although I said earlier that with 99% of our products we were specifically instructed to ensure non-toxicity. There were more than a few projects we worked on that were meant to create symptoms without causing any real harm to the subjects. What is the overall agenda driving chemtrails? Control. Whether it's over people, the weather, the environment, it all boils down to control. It's human nature to want to be in control. And I differ with him on that point. I think human nature is to cooperate and to care for the things that you love. That's human nature, not control. Psychopaths and sociopaths need control. But real human beings, we want to live and let live, and cooperate, and love, and be caretakers of our environment. You know, here he talks about patents. He says, our mixtures were never patented, mainly because patents are public information. Our mixtures were never patented for the purpose of plausible deniability and lack of a paper trail. Keep in mind that nearly everything we were contracted to do was not legal by any sense of the word. I can, however, remember one project that was designed to work differently based on sunlight levels. It was a weather modification project. Okay, so in other words, if there's a patent, it's almost certainly a diversion, that it's not the real program going on. Again, it's to siphon resources away from the truth movement. You know, a bunch of people go study these patents, and that takes them away from the real program that's going on. And I'm not trying to criticize anybody for publishing these patents, but a real classified program is not going to leave a paper trail hanging out there for the public to latch onto. He says he won't give the exact years of his employment, but it was from the early 80s to early 2000s. Not sure when the spraying started exactly, but judging from scientific papers we based on some of our research on, it didn't take long after the dawn of modern chemistry for people to learn that chemicals can be used for nefarious purposes as well as good ones. He says, with complete confidence, that even our most dangerous mixtures never had a more than 1 in 50,000 mortality rate, assuming they were deployed as advised. Yeah, right. Can some chemtrails amplify the effects of HAARP? Sorry, I really don't know anything about HAARP other than they are believed to be actively researching weather modification. If they ever contracted our services, I never knew. And this is the kind of answer that someone in a classified program has to give, because you cannot go home and Google a bunch of conspiracy stuff if you have a high security clearance, because that makes you a security risk. So his answer about HAARP is perfect for a realistic scenario. In the way his lab was structured, by the time I left, everyone in our lab fell into two groups: 55 years and older, or less than 5 to 10 years out of college. I actually felt like they did this on purpose to minimize the chance we would keep in contact with anyone still in the business after retiring. Besides the mountains of non-disclosure agreements I was forced to sign. But no, I don't keep in contact with anyone still conducting research. So that makes perfect sense from a psychological control standpoint, that you separate your group into two age groups that have nothing in common. His mixtures worked via inhalation, absorption, and ingestion. So once they spray you, I don't know. He talks about later how to avoid it, but did your compounds ever cloak the sky? I'm not sure what you mean. As in, they were intended to block out the sun. If that is the case, no. Was this for the military? I have no idea. Still don't to this day. I have a BS in chemistry and PhD in biochemistry. North America is not the only continent to use aerially dispersed chemicals. How do you feel about what you've done? Not great. I would feel much, much worse if non-toxicity had not been as much of a concern as it was. But even so, I've dealt with a great amount of regret since retirement, developed a drinking problem, but I've managed to come to terms with my nearly 2 decades of work, and I'm ready to accept whatever fate awaits me. He's sort of committing suicide by coming clean here. Sort of just a resignation, statement of resignation. So their lab was often tasked with trying to create a spray that would destroy short-term memory. So yes, I'm sure I wasn't the only one from our team who wondered why we were never asked to work on long-term memory. In retrospect, I wouldn't be surprised if both were contracted out to a different lab after our failure to achieve desirable short-term memory results. And here's a specific question about serotonin and the different structures in the brain. And he mentions liposomes for delivering these chemicals. I mean, this is a scientist or somebody who's done a lot of reading on the subject. Did your chemicals work the way up the food chain, or did they disappear? You brought up an excellent question. Some of our chemicals were designed to linger in the environment, some up to a year, regardless of subsequent weather. And in one case, we were asked to design a compound that would accumulate and move up the food chain, although humans were not the target organism. I can't tell you the specific animal, but I can say that the target organism in the food chain were not mammals. So he could be talking about plankton, or fish, or something that's going to really cause a lot of bioconcentration. Another thing, if he said they were mammals, he could be talking about chronic wasting disease, which is killing off deer, moose, elk in the western and northern part of North America. Chronic wasting disease is just like mad cow disease for deer, only it's extremely contagious, and that could easily have been developed in a U.S. bioweapon lab and then sprayed from these damn planes. And that would be to destroy the possibility of living off the land by making deer a deadly food to eat. Likewise with the red tides. The first of the red tides happened in a cold Canadian lake in the northeast, and now it's all over the Gulf and the California coast. These are ideal. I mean, you wait till the conditions are right and you spray it from an airplane, you got red tide. So this guy has done some real damage to our planet, and we honestly don't know what's going on anymore. He says the only way to protect yourself is a full-face respirator. He also says not a micron sieve, but a nanometer sieve, which if you've ever tried to breathe through one of those, you can't really breathe through it. So who's going to wear that? He says that the reason I have concerns over populated areas is the amount of money. There's a lot of money in what we did, not just the R&D, but the production of the final result on a large scale. The sheer expenses required would make it all but ridiculous to spray on areas that aren't heavily populated. So he's saying that if you live in a city, you're going to be sprayed. If you live out in the boonies, you're not going to be sprayed. Which neural receptors were they supposed to bind to? The chemtrails. Classes of chemicals, really just about everything, some organic, some not. Like I said earlier, there are only a handful of elements on the periodic table that we never experimented with for one purpose or another. That's implying he sprayed uranium and all kinds of really bad things. Some were very similar to modern medicines. Think stereoisomers. Now this is a key statement here. So in other words, they took a patented pharmaceutical like Prozac or these antidepressants with the fluorine in it, and they just made a mirror image of the molecule and tested that. So that would be a quick and dirty way to come up with a possible spray chemical without doing a lot of research. So to me that's really key that he would say, just parenthesis, think stereoisomers. While others mimicked naturally occurring molecules, we had projects involved just about every class of neurotransmitter receptors you can think of. What kind of calming effects were expected? Calming effect is pretty self-descriptive. Things that would normally elicit certain emotions in people no longer would. I probably lived in a city that was sprayed before, no clue if it was with one of the calming agents we designed. If there are ADCs, aerially dispersed chemicals, that have been developed for combating global warming, my lab never played a role in their development. That makes sense because these are biochemists doing pharmaceuticals, and for just screening out the sun you want physicists and jet fuel chemists. There was a question about did you ever include like a tagging marker with your chemtrail pharmaceutical, and he said no, we never did. You know, the thing would be people show up in the emergency room and then you could test something else, maybe swipe their skin or do a blood test, and this biochemist said no, we never did, it was too dangerous, and we have no idea how the tests went. It wasn't our department. And I bolded the wrong question here. Is it possible your job was just a diversion? If my job was a diversion, it would probably be the most expensive diversion in the history of mankind, so my guess is no. What symptoms have been seen in animal trials? General malaise, ineffective sleep cycles, orthostatic instability, in other words, changing blood chemistry, mood swings, to name a few. Well, you know, these are the illnesses that maybe half of Americans actually have now, especially as you get into your 50s and 60s. So how do you prove that you're not sick from something that was sprayed invisibly from a plane? Some chemicals were meant to degrade within 48 hours. Others were meant to persist in the environment for up to a year. A year. The guy asked, did you have fluoride in your chemtrail pharmaceuticals? He said, in the reduced anion form of fluorine, F-, no. So this is a chemist's way of saying that in a covalently bonded molecule like Prozac or these selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor antidepressants, yes, we had covalently bonded fluorine, not ionic fluorine, because an ion, as it falls through the atmosphere, will bond with whatever trash it can bump into. So this is a chemist's way of saying, yeah, we did. Are chemtrails released in engines with fuel vapor or separate tanks? None of the projects we ever worked on were intended to be mixed with jet fuel. That's because these delicate organic molecules will burn up. Everything we developed was meant for standalone deployment. And of course there's a German Airbus maintenance mechanic who actually found these nozzles. He found a secret tank next to the toilet wastewater tank, and he was fired for finding that stuff. And so incidentally, the guy that services the wastewater tank on these airliners is also adding that chemical mix from his little septic collecting truck. And that's what that German airline mechanic said. And I recommend, if you don't know about this, go look it up on YouTube. How long ago were they introduced? And he says crop dusting happened in the 30s. Probably happened pretty darn early. And we know by the 1960, CIA was looking into this actively. He says detox kits are bogus, they're not going to help, and this guy would know, wouldn't he? So again, he says every chemical mixture my laboratory worked on was meant to be deployed aerially. In some cases, however, bodies of water were the target rather than direct contact with humans. So again, things like the red tide, how do we know that these aren't actually a bioweapon that are being sprayed periodically? Dies down, they spray it again. So we ask him about chronic fatigue syndrome, and he says these are all described symptoms of chronic fatigue syndrome that we saw in test animals during trials on this project. I'm not sure I understand. In other words, he's saying chronic fatigue syndrome, this is one of the things that's produced by their chemicals, and that's really common now. How do you protect yourself from chemtrails? I live in a remote area, that is all. So here's a poll, and he answered yes to 3 and 5. So 3 is some trails in the sky are chemtrails, but most are contrails. He says yes, that's true. 5, he says, is true. Chemtrails nor contrails need be visible. Visibility is coincidental. So he's saying that his sprays are generally invisible. And that's something new, because we all look up and expect to see a heavy smoke trail, but this guy's saying it's invisible. He also says answer 4 is common misconception. It's wrong. Chemtrails are persistent trails. Contrails are not persistent. Again, that depends on the humidity and temperature, and there's a thing called the Appleby chart where you can look that up and determine, hey, that's not water vapor, and that one is water vapor. So I need to make a video on the Appleby chart. Answer 2 is naive denial. All trails in the sky are contrails. Chemtrails don't exist. He says that's wrong. Chemtrails do exist. Answer 1 is simply not true. All trails in the sky are chemtrails. Contrails are... doesn't make sense. All trails in the sky are chemtrails. That is simply not true. He was asked to give a specific list of chemicals, and he says, I'm not comfortable releasing specific data like that. What advice would you give to find a way to get this stopped? I'm pretty pessimistic about getting this stopped. Writing a letter to your congressman isn't going to help. Going to the media isn't going to help unless you have solid, undeniable proof. And I think that's where Dane has helped us so much, by gathering that proof and going to the media over and over. Here's another poll, and it's the reasons chemtrails exist. And he answers 2, 5, 6, and 11. So 2, weather modification, increase or decrease rain, snow, intensity of storms, etc. It's a peaceful use. 5, mind or mood control, population behavioral modification. 6, fertility and population reduction, soft kill experimentation or operations. And this is actually happening now because 1 in 3 young women is infertile and 1 in 2 young men are infertile. So our population is actually dying off now. At least those are the latest medical statistics that I seem to recall. 11 is riot control or crowd management experimentation operations. It seems like a lot of people have a lot of false ideas what chemtrails are being used for, but as I said, this is only based on the sort of research my lab was doing. It's certainly possible that there were others. So he's asked about fibers, spider webs, morgellons, and he says, I never developed any chemicals that would appear as fibers, filaments, web-like strands. No offense, but your posts are coming off as pretty wild even to me. So back in 2012, I don't think that technology, I mean, it's just a jet fuel technology, I think. So he wasn't involved in that. He was asked about antidepressants. He said, yes, we generally worked on products involving antidepressant effects. These projects were generally easy, like creating a stereoisomer. Most of the time, we would use chemicals similar, if not identical, to prescription medications and merely adapt them to aerial dispersal. What was the most dangerous compound you worked on? I don't want to get into the details of the most dangerous compound we gave final approval on. It wasn't extremely toxic by any means, but it still bothered me that we didn't declare it a failure. Did you actually monitor the mice yourself? Yes, we conducted all animal trials in-house. Symptoms results varied greatly depending on the project at hand. Some results took minutes to manifest, others nearly the entire lifetime of the test animal. All tests were conducted using aerosol dispersion of the mixture, as this is how it would be deployed in the field. Fatal effects were common. Repeating that. Fatal effects were common. If these fatal effects were too common, despite attempts to rectify these effects, the project would be declared a failure. Yes, our first route following fatal trials would be to decrease dosage and observe whether we still obtain the desired effects without previous levels of fatality. Okay, so that means going out to get your mail and then going back in, you get the desired dosage, but working outside all day or exercising outside, you get a fatal dose. That's how I read that. That sounds extremely like what's going on nowadays. Are they spending millions or billions on these projects as a whole? Millions/billions. The investment of our contractors per project was likely somewhere between $10 million to $1 billion per project. So, per project, $10 million to $1 billion. That's incredible. But yes, I can believe it. It was made very clear to us from day one that going public would not be in our best interest. Yeah, no kidding. What U.S. military personnel did you see associated with your work? Never had any interactions with U.S. military. If they ever contracted the services of our lab, I never knew. Like I've said in previous posts, the entire system was extremely compartmentalized, never had any clue who we were conducting research for. I wouldn't be surprised at all if foreign militaries were looking into the same sort of research that we were conducting for our contractors. No one outside of our small group of employees were ever in our lab, except for a few exceptions. Never any politicians. I'd imagine that it would be quite a risk for them, especially given the number of security cameras we had in our lab. Then his last post, he was asked to watch a video and register on GLP, and he says, I'm not sure why you keep asking me to register on this site. Do you have an ulterior motive? So that was his very last posting, and it was 12 days after the first post, and he kept the same IP address the whole time. So I'm sure he got found, or they instantly knew his location. So It sounds like he's an old guy, smokes marijuana to forget, drinks scotch, and didn't know that his IP address could be traced back to his mountain cabin. So folks, I believe that this is a real testimony and explains what that big white building at Tinker Air Force Base either was or is. So at any moment people can go over there and start cooking up some pharmaceutical cocktails, which are then added to the sprays. So I'm hoping this is elucidates the program a little bit better for people. You know, I studied this post for a long time to see any sign of disinformation, and I do not see anything that indicates that it was disinformation. It looks genuine to me, it looks sincere. So if this is helpful information to folks, please throw a buck my way on Patreon. And I'm really very honored that people listen to my videos. Thank you very much.